Good afternoon and welcome to the Preservation Association of Lincoln Brown Bag Lecture Series. My name is Eileen Burkton. I'm the coordinator of these brown bags. Our lecture today is sponsored by the Preservation Association of Lincoln. If you're interested in these programs, please join our membership. The membership is available at preservelincoln.org. Our speaker today is Dr. Joel Williamsen, a native of Craig, Nebraska, which is located about 70 miles north of here in Burt County, Nebraska. Joel was a registered scholar graduating from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln in 1983 with a bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering. He finished his PhD in systems engineering in 1993 at the University of Alabama. In the last 35 years, Dr. Williamsen has worked as a spacecraft designer for NASA and a test engineer for Pentagon weapon systems, currently at the Institute of Defense Analysis. He lives in Huntsville, Alabama with his wife, Linda, 4 children and 4 grandchildren. Dr. Williamsen discovered the 1894 Rock Island wreck while researching his novel, Barrel House Boys, at the Library of Congress in 2008. His family placed the historical marker at the wreck site in 2011. And the marker reads, "A northbound Rock Island train was derailed from this trestle on August 9th, 1894, resulting in a crash, massive fire, and the death of 11 passengers and crew. Despite the heroic action of Harry Foote, brakeman, who rescued many, G.W. Davis, convicted of the crime in 1895, was paroled 10 years later by Governor John Mickey, who noted grave doubts as to his guilt. Aside from questions of guilt, Davis's motive and whether he acted alone also remains matter of conjecture." This is the topic of his talk today. 125 years ago, Lincoln's Rock Island Railroad wreck, August 9th, 1894. Please help me in joining Joel.
Thank you, Eileen. I appreciate that. I'm going to try to find am I coming through okay? Can you all hear me? Great. Thank you for welcoming me here today. I really appreciate coming back to Nebraska. My folks still live up in Burt County, and visit my sister just today in Fort Calhoun, so it's great to see you all here. And of course, it's great to be back in Lincoln. Of course, we've had some changes, and we'll certainly look at some changes that have happened 125 years ago. We did have a really nice turnout Friday night for the 125th anniversary vigil at the wreck site. We joined there together, and we rang out the names and spoke the names of the 11 victims that passed away right there at the wreck site. So I think we had a nice turnout, about 30 folks, but I'm overwhelmed. Great to see all of you here too. Just get right to it. In 1894, there was drought and there was poverty, and it was a very difficult time. Clearly, the drought was one of the worst that the country had seen. Corn was up to 56 cents a bushel, which for that time was unheard of at the stock markets. There was a large number of people. Farms were failing. There was a kind of a mini dust bowl that had occurred at that point. Lincoln was surrounded by large groups of people who were out of work. It was a lot like the Depression period during that time. And so that was the period of time that this sat within. Lincoln itself was a growing city. It was bustling. It had electric lights all the way up and down O Street. Most of them were arc lights. Hundreds of telephone users. Electric trolleys were being installed in the downtown area, but they were still being pulled by horses at that time. And there were 5 railroad stations in town. 5 railroads were operating with stations here in Lincoln at that time. There was the Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific. Later, they just called it the Rock Island or the Rock. The Missouri Pacific, the Burlington, Fremont, Elkhorn, and Missouri Valley, the FE and MV, and the Union Pacific. And the Union Pacific was an interesting one. It and the Missouri Pacific, the Burlington lines, they crossed down in the lower portion of the screen. You can see the dotted line and the straight line there. Those were the Union Pacific and the Missouri Pacific crossed down, and you can see where in the corner of our screen, there's actually where the Rock Island Railroad crossed. So you can see that there was a crossing that occurred at that number 1 that's down there, and that's the wreck site that we're going to be talking about here. Located today in Wilderness Park, still on the edge of the city, and very near I think it's the Densmore ball fields that are down there. So here's downtown Lincoln. Who all has been to the Rock Island Depot? Who knows where that is, right? Okay. So there's a number of folks that know that. What street is it on? Do we know? O Street, right. Exactly. And what does it operate as today? A bank, exactly. Beautiful building, isn't it? But we'll show a picture here in a little bit that shows was in the middle of nowhere. There was no large O Street going past it at that time. It was all pasture land around it. So not surrounded by the university, although it was still near the university as the university was growing. So the Burlington station in the Haymarket area is not where the train was headed. We have a beautiful Burlington station, but that was only one of 5 stations scattered around the northern part of the town. Here's the actual CR and IP depot on O Street where the train was headed. And you can see there's just not a whole lot there. You can see the rail that's going right past it, running pretty much north and south at that point. No crossing street for O Street. You can see, usually it's right up against the street, right? You can see it's very near O Street. It's not there. Here's the picture of it today that you can see at the corner of 20th and O. Now a bank. Who remembers what it used to be? Anybody? Ice cream parlor about 40 years ago, before it was a bank. People used to go there for hot dogs and other things after a university game, etc. So other things were happening this same week. In fact, it was a lot of unrest happening. Just 3 days before the wreck, on August 6th, there was a riot that occurred in Omaha. And what happened was there were meat packing plants, primarily staffed by Bohemian workers. And they went on strike. They didn't think that they were getting fair pay for what they were getting. And so they went on strike about a week before August 6th. And of course, the meatpackers brought in laborers from around because there was plenty of labor, a lot of people out of work. And so the meatpackers did not like that. And so 3 were killed in riots just prior to the train wreck. It could be the heat, and it could be lots of other things contributing. There were lots of things going on at that time. But one of the people who was sent to put down this riot on August 10th was Colonel C.J. Bills, who was the head of one of the militia corps. They were exercising in Lincoln during that time. The militia, they always did it one week a month. It turns out that the rioters chose the wrong time to have their riot because the militia was encamped around Lincoln. Colonel C.J. Bills was on the train going to Lincoln on the night of the wreck, and he was involved in the wreck. And of course, the next day, he headed off to Omaha with the militia, and they put down the strikers. So a lot of things happening during that time. Here's the Fairbury Depot, which was the origin of the train. The train left about 7:30 at night. And you can see the one on the left is today's 1914 station. But the one on the right is the one that actually was what was there during that time. It was still a 2-story building, and it was the headquarters of the Western Division of the CRINP. You don't think of something as small as Fairbury being the Western Division headquarters of the Rock, but it was. In fact, for a long time, and you would think a larger building, et cetera, but the upper story was mostly for the management, and the lower story was for the passengers and the running of the railroad during that time. And of course, there are train yards that were around that at that time too. But I found it interesting. There was a fire that had occurred just before 1914, and they did go ahead and keep pretty much the same footprint and layout, just a very different kind of style on it, right? So this is the train itself that left at 7:30 a.m. or something very similar to it. This is a 440 engine. It weighs about 80 tons fully loaded. It had four large driving wheels. You can see the four wheels in the back, and then the four smaller wheels, guide wheels in the front. So that's called a 440 because there's no wheels behind the large driving wheels. So these were very fast. They could travel at speeds up to 80 miles an hour. You could make 70 or 80 with these if you had a very light load. One train very similar to this with a little bit larger driving wheels was clocked in at 126 miles an hour just that year up in New York. So you could really move with these, but your rail had to be in extremely good condition in order for that to happen. So this was train number 8, engine 213, and it had a Fort Worth accommodation that it was hauling. So that meant that it had a steam train. It had the caboose, which is called the coal tender or the tender, okay? And then it had a combination car, which was a combination smoker car, as well as the smokers would, like a lounge where you would hang out. And you wouldn't think you'd combine this with a lounge, but there was a kind of a place where you would put baggage and you would haul your mail there. And then the passenger car was behind that. And now there was no caboose. That's a mistake here. There was no caboose on that car. But there was a total of 33 passengers and crew, and 11 people were lost at that time. So how did that happen? Well, we'll just leave this up for just a moment and talk about it a bit. This train was supposed to arrive at 9:30, and it was moving fast and making up time because it left the station late. It was supposed to leave about 7:30, and it left about 10 minutes to 8. So you're making up 20 minutes of time between here and Fairbury. That means you're going to have to really move. In fact, it was probably going way too fast for the rails that it was on. There had been complaints to people before that were printed in the paper that said, this rail is not in the best condition anymore, and a lot of rails were that way. The railroads were in serious financial condition back in 1894, and the reason was that their big cash cow, which was being given large grants of free land to sell next to the railroads, they weren't there anymore. People had already bought up all that land, and all the land that had been given and granted to them to start up a railroad was gone. So they had to now survive on the fares that they got. And believe it or not, 5 railroads coming into Lincoln is plenty of coverage for the size town that Lincoln was at that time. So the tracks were probably not in great shape, but it was clear that when they were running along this, the moonlight on the rails, you could see moving along. You could see that the engineer didn't have a lot of light shedding ahead for him. That's not a big electric light there. That's a gas light. Okay, so you can maybe see a little bit around you. You might be able to see 50, 100 feet ahead. Maybe you had to have sharp eyes to do that. And of course, if one of you is a fireman and shoveling, the other one's the engineer watching the boiler. You're not watching the track 100% of the time. And of course, you can't see the track extremely well because you have to reach out and look out past the boiler. So they were making time when they hit the edge of the Rock Island Bridge. Now, the Rock Island Bridge was 400 feet long. The trestle spanned from over 2 lines, the Union Pacific, the Missouri Pacific, and it turns out that it was about 40 feet up above these tracks at its highest point. If you go out to see the wreck today, it's about that same height today. The actual bridge that's out there is the grandson of the original bridge that was there. The original bridge was all made out of wood. And of course, how many of you have walked along railroad tracks? You know what happens to ties, right? In the summer sun, the pitch starts to come out of them, right? They have creosote that's in them that's used as a preservative for the wood, right, to keep the bugs out and other sorts of things and make them last longer from water. But what happens is in the heat of the summer, they get they could go up fast. You can burn them. They're easy to burn. So that night, this is from the August 10th Journal. It did depart a little after 7:30. It was traveling 50 miles an hour, and when it hit the edge of the bridge, the rails immediately spread. What happens is the rails were there, but the weight of the train, unless there's the clamps and that clamp them to the ties, and the spikes that are there, unless they're there, those rails will spread apart. Okay, because the weight of the train will just naturally make them spread. There's a little curvature on the top of the rail, and that ends up pushing them to the side. So when that happens, the train keeps going forward, and it hits the next rail, which isn't spread apart. Okay, and when that happens, it jolts the entire train and it knocks it off the track. So hitting at 50 miles an hour, he probably had a half a second or a second's worth of notice. Before he saw that, he had enough time to say 3 words, probably the last words of the engineer Ike DePue's life was "down the sand," which means you had sand that was located in front of the main wheels. You try to lock the wheels up, and you try to increase the friction so that you would stop. Well, it was way too late at that point. They were moving way too fast. And so it was an awful sight. When the train plunged from this bridge, you can see the direction of travel roughly north there, crossing these rails. It went off the left side of the bridge. It crashed onto the Union Pacific track, and when it hit, the boiler blew up. The boiler had over 125 psi hot steam, and was huge, of course. And sitting behind it is this box of coals, okay, so it's just very, very hot. And so when that blew, it blew these hot coals directly straight up in the air, okay, or nearly straight up in the air, back onto the trestle that you see here. And of course, being made of wood, it caught on fire very quickly. And by morning, that trestle burned completely down to the ground. There wasn't really anything left. We'll see in some of the subsequent pictures. So just looking at it, these are all words that were directly from the August 10th State Journal. There was, after the train engine went down, the coal car fell on top of it, rolled past it. Then the next car, the combination car, came down, and as it followed the train, it broke free of the coal car and twisted, and it actually rotated 180 degrees. It just did a roll. And so it rolled so that its top was on the bottom and that its wheels were in the air. So the heaviest part of one of these cars is the wheels, right? Each one of these cars weighs about 10 tons or so, and most of it is in the bottom half of the wheels and the trucks, they call them. So once that spun, it slammed down into the ground, and people were buried down underneath these trucks. And of course, it caught on fire. So the fourth car that came down was the passenger car, and it didn't. It kind of just slid down this hill. It kind of slid down the embankment, and was the last one in. It stayed upright, and everyone who was on board that car survived. There were injuries, but everyone who passed were lost in either the engine, which was the engineer and the fireman, and then the conductor and 8 others passed away in the combination car. There was an immediate rescue that tried to take place, and of course the first thing they did, C.J. Bills and Harry Foote, a brakeman, as well as Mr. McDowell, Jay McDowell was there, and they immediately started to rescue everyone in the back car, and everyone got out. At that point, Colonel Bills and Jay McDowell said, "Look, there's nobody we're going to be able to save in that front car. It's upside down, it's on fire, people are screaming. The best thing we can do now is to go get some help for some of the people that we've got." And it's horrible, but they knew that the penitentiary was nearby and that the penitentiary had a phone. So those two men, after they were rescued, they rescued the people in the back car, they ran to the penitentiary. And they were eventually able to phone some people and get the fire brigade back down, too late, of course, the police and everyone else. So they were alerted by phone at first from the penitentiary. The people, however, Harry Foote was still left there, and according to most accounts, he had either a broken leg or a broken arm, but one or the other. Later accounts gave him a broken arm as well as a broken leg, but he was in bad shape. He was clearly limping, and he said, look, we can't let these people die there. He had friends that were on board. The baggage master who was aboard there needed to get out, and Cherry, a good friend of his who was a postage clerk. There were another brakeman, and of course the passengers that were in there. So he went there to that flaming wreck, and he started beating out the flames where he could with a coat, and then he started breaking things with an axe and started to try to get into a spot. What's that? Okay. So we've got a real rescue that's going on, and it was difficult at that point to try to figure out whether or not they were going to get out. How am I for time? I'm at 25 after 12. I'm good? Okay. So at that point, he was able to rescue 6 out of that car. So 6 people survived from that car because of his efforts, and mostly his efforts alone. So that's why I think Harry Foote is really the hero of this scene. And as much as we like to think about, the hard times and having the tragedy of losing 11 people, at times like that, you have to look for, like Mr. Rogers says, right? You have to look for the helpers. You have to look for the people who are willing to do something about it. And he was. So here's our wreck scene the next morning. Do you think they're wearing umbrellas because of the rain? No, we hadn't had rain for weeks and weeks. It's the sun, right? We've got to think about going down to this wreck site. And if I had a pointer, I'd point out to you. Do you see the end of the engine that's almost highest? There's a small bell there that's a little pressurized chamber there. You can see kind of a black hollow area underneath that underneath that engine, and they're all looking at the same place because they're looking at the skull of the engineer, Ike DePew, who's looking back at them there. So that white blob with the 2 black spots is actually the skull of the engineer. So they could see that, and of course he was lying there for much of the day until they finally moved the engine. Within 24 hours, they were able to move that engine off the Union Pacific tracks, and the Union Pacific tracks opened up again. They had to bring in a big machine in order to just grab that and to hoist it to the side. They didn't carry it away, but they at least got it out of the way. And so 24 hours later, people were operating on that line. And of course, within 24 hours, they'd already begun to rebuild the bridge. There was a lot of labor there in town. Let's take a look at what that looked like. So here's what the crowd looked like. You can see off on the right-hand side, the engine is just barely up on the Union Pacific tracks. You can see that there would be tracks for the other railroad in our foreground here. You can see that there's an awful lot of people there, and you can see there's almost nothing left of that bridge there, is there? That trestle is burned almost completely away. It's just gone. Now, some of the footings were there, and they used those footings to rebuild this bridge. And within 1 week, that bridge was back in operation for the Rock Island. Their line was open again. And that's a tribute to how hard they were working and how, frankly, desperate a lot of the folks were to try to get some help there. There were hundreds of people out of work, and they put them all to work at $1 a day. So $2 a day if you had a mule. That was also a story that my grandfather liked to tell me. That so the mule was actually paid more than the men were. But this is the list of all the folks that were lost. It was a hard list to compile because it was split up among the different newspapers. But the first ones, of course, were Ike DePew, the engineer, C.D. Stannard, who was the conductor, and Bill Craig, who was the fireman. And then, of course, there were a number of other folks that were there as well. But they were able to rescue their friends, the crewmen that were there underneath that second car. And that's why Harry Foots worked so hard at it. Just talking a little bit more about the rescue here. Colonel C.J. Bills, as we talked about, they extricated themselves from the rear car. They went on search of a telephone office or telegraph office. And then Stannard was under the front car. He tried to cry for help. He died in the flames. They weren't able to get to him in time. Broken foot and leg to extend assistance. So a lot of crying, a lot of screaming, and finally, when they finally got them out, about 40 minutes later, the Burlington and Missouri line train came from the south and took everybody from the city. So that was the story. So what happened? How do we know this was a wreck? Well, really, it started with the farmers. Right next door, you remember the Salt Creek kind of has some tributaries down in that area, right? And so there was some water around, and so farmers came running with buckets, and in order to try to put out the fire. It's pretty little and pretty late, but they did hear within half a mile to a mile, they did hear that was nearby. So they came running, and they found all kinds of things. They found a big crowbar that was right next to the wreck. They found that there were different kinds of things called fish plates, which hold down the rails, okay? There were a number of crossed the crowbars. There were just a number of things that were missing, clearly missing, tossed to the side. How long would it take to wreck a train like this? Well, they didn't actually remove the rails, okay? Those are very, very heavy. It takes guys to move those things, right? All they really had to do was to loosen it up enough so that the weight of the engine itself would pry those apart. But you had to do it on purpose. So a pair of folks were key in establishing that there was some kind of wrecking going on. One was a Detective Malone and his brother, who was Fire Chief Malone. At the same time, they were actually, there's people don't hire family in the city of Lincoln, right? That doesn't happen. But they were happening then, and the fire chief was the city detective's brother. And so they were both out there within probably 2 hours or so of the wreck, and they they talked to some witnesses, and they saw that there was a young man who had shown up who had been there with a lantern within minutes. Well, he had beaten all the farmers there. If he wasn't on site, he was within a minute or two away from being on site, and he showed up with a lantern. Now he didn't really help that much with the wreck. He just was there, and he was noticed by that. We talked a little bit about this, and who was that guy that they saw? Well, his name was George Washington Davis. He had been in prison before, and he lived in Lincoln. He worked for a local farmer, and he essentially hung around a lot at the clubs that were in downtown Lincoln. There were clubs for African Americans at that time, and he claimed originally, when he talked to the detective the next day, finally traced him down and said, "Hey, we recognize this guy." Some of the witnesses said, I know who that was. So he traced him down to where the farmer he was working at, and he said, well, I wasn't there. I ran from the colored club. I ran from the club that was there downtown, in his words. And he said, I wasn't there, but I got there very quickly. And so that didn't make a lot of sense because people had seen him so quickly after the wreck. There was some ambiguity there. And then he said, the detective was kind of a smart guy, and he knows how to ask tricky questions. I think that's probably what detectives do, right? They ask tricky questions. And he said, well, what was it like? Was it really noisy when it went? And he said, well, it wasn't too noisy until the boiler blew, and then it really got noisy. And then he caught himself, and he said, oh, I just found out, I just admitted to being at the wreck site. And George Davis talked an awful lot before he got a lawyer. So once they arrested him, later that day on suspicion. And for the next 48 hours, he just talked to whoever wanted to talk to him. And he gave several different stories as to what had occurred. But one of the stories that was featured in the State Journal was the fact that he had said to one of his cellmates that he had not done that by himself, and he couldn't ever talk about it, because if he did, he feared for his life. So my impression from the testimony was that was given as hearsay evidence was that he may not have been involved as the leader of this, but he may have been a patsy. He may have been someone that they coerced to doing it. And why would that have been? One of the reasons that people think about when they look at this is there was an awful lot of unemployment, and the best employer was the railroad. So if you could see damage to a train rail, and stop it before it occurred, you would be a hero. And there was a chance that you could get a job that way. Now, he had tried several times to get a job with the railroad, and they had turned him down. But there's a record of him having tried to do that. And that's kind of the case that they brought forward at his second trial. At his first trial, it was a hung jury. They could not convict him of first-degree murder. In other words, the jury refused to find that he had premeditated the deaths of all the people aboard that train. Instead, the judge said, okay, if you can't agree on first-degree murder, I'll allow him to be tried for second-degree murder, which essentially is, I caused a lot of mischief and death happened because of what I did, directly because of what I did, but I didn't intend for people to die. And that's much more consistent with the kinds of case that they made at the second trial, which was, you may have been misled into that, or you may have just wanted to stop the train, but something stopped him from stopping the train. He wasn't out there and didn't try to stop the train. Everyone agrees with that. So he either chickened out and didn't want to be anywhere near that, or got afraid at the last minute, or he got some help and someone perhaps didn't allow him to stop that train. Why did people wreck trains? What would be the motive behind wrecking trains? Well, there were a lot of train wrecks that happened during that time. If you look at the early 1890s, they're filled with instances of people wrecking trains. And the main culprits behind it were not robbers who wanted to go rob the car after it wrecked. There almost had no instances of that. They weren't kids that were running around trying to, just have fun. Most of it is brought back to the question of economy. There were too many trains running. And if you could wreck someone else's train, that's a lot of inventory that you've just taken off the market. You've slowed them down, you've stopped your competitors, and you've increased your bottom line. My view, and the view of many historians, is that these train wreckers were wrecking one another. They were train operators that didn't like one another and essentially had teams of people who did that. I think that George Washington Davis was caught between his ambition to try to get a job and between his desperation to try to make a better life for himself. And he either got afraid or was prevented from doing what he intended to do, in my view, and that was to stop the train. So just a few other things here. How are we doing on time? We're doing fine. If you don't mind, I'll just talk a little bit more about the historical marker. Look at that handsome fella. I'm talking about my dad. He's in the left-hand picture. So this is my dad and my mom who were there when we put the marker down, and I was just very proud that they were able to be there. And it was nice that I was able to meet a couple of the people who came to the 125th remembrance last Friday night were actually there at that site. So this was our candlelight vigil without candles. We weren't allowed to have actual open fire. Good idea, right? But we were able to bring these small electric candles. Hobby Lobby, works really good. So again, this was something that really just occurred to me 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago. Just like everyone else, time sneaks up on us. I have a day job and a very busy job, but I thought, this is really interesting. It's a nice round number. Let's bring it back into people's mind perhaps a little bit. And that and the fact that I'm working on I'm working on a musical version of this, a musical play version of this book. So should or anyone else know somebody who would be interested in performing or producing something like that, you can get hold of me at barrelhouseboysjw@gmail.com. So would love to hear from folks, even if that's not their case. Just talk a little bit more about the rec site and what Harry Foote looked like. The proposal right now on the board, and anybody ever heard of this, that they're talking about putting a bridge across that track there because it would connect two large bike paths. Now it's expensive, right? This is probably $1 million bridge from what I've been able to gather on it. Here's another picture of it right here. 2.2, thank you. Was that you, Eileen? Okay, thank you. So yes, it's expensive. But I really think it would be a proper thing to do, and it would be wonderful if we could name it the Footbridge. I think it'd be great to see remembering Harry Foote and the fact that it's a footbridge kind of all comes together there, right? So I would love to see us put that together. I'll open my I'll open it up for questions if anybody's got some questions out there for a few minutes. Otherwise, I'll go on and talk about the rest of the book. Yes?
Well, a little bit before the period of your book, it's interesting that the Rock Island did not come along this path through Lincoln. You
Okay.
may be aware of that.
Yes.
What they did was they had a line around the back of the fairground.
Mhm.
They went onto the Union Pacific, went down on the Union Pacific to Beatrice, and then back onto their own track.
Okay.
And so shortly before this accident happened, they had built a connecting line from Lincoln down to Jansen, Nebraska.
Okay.
So that kind of maybe feeds on your theory that the competitors weren't real.
They weren't very happy on it, were they? I really appreciate that information. And it was a new station, so that corroborates what you're saying. That station was very, very new in 1894. Yes.
And then, if you research a little bit of that history, what was happening was the Union Pacific, being the host railroad, was not real kind to the Rock Island trains. They would delay them.
Oh, interesting.
And then a dispute in Omaha occurred between Union Pacific and Rock Island, and the Union Pacific actually blocked the Rock Island tracks.
How about that?
In Beatrice.
Yeah, so they didn't like each other.
No. And so that's why the Rock Island didn't build its
That's
own
interesting.
line.
I really appreciate that. What's your name, sir?
Richard Schmeling.
Nice to meet you, Richard. We'll talk afterwards, I hope. Yes, so clearly, that's my view, anyway. Any other quick questions? Yes, go ahead.
Joel, from the newspaper accounts, were you able to determine, I know you showed a map of where the train was crossing.
Right.
And the approach. Do you know where the tracks were loosened? Was it on the approach or on the trestle?
It was right at the edge of the trestle. And of course, the edge of the trestle was slightly in a different spot than it is today because it's the steel trestle, it's on concrete. At that point, it wasn't. It was just on wood at that point. There was no concrete in the background, but it was right at the edge. It's exactly where you'd put it if you wanted to derail a train and make it go over the edge. It wasn't in the middle of the trestle. It was right at the edge of the trestle. As you enter the trestle, that's where it would spread, and you could do nothing else at that point, right? Great question. Yes?
Wasn't the Rock Island the last train to actually get to Lincoln? It didn't come till Lincoln till...
I think it may have been, and you may know more about it, sir, but I believe that was the fifth train that actually
Some of
was
them
there.
came in the 1870s.
Right, they were still building up in the late 1880s, early 1890s, and Fairbury was the Western Division, so you could see that their plan was to continue to go west, and they did go west from there. Okay. Just a couple of other things about the book. I'll just hold it up here. You can get this on Amazon. I don't think there's a place in town that carries it anymore, but I'll talk to the Historical Society. Maybe they'll start stocking it again. That would be nice. Just some other people. When I wrote the book, I wanted to put real people in it that were actually in Lincoln at the time. So it's a historical novel. Tom Turpin came through town. You may not know that name very well, but he actually was the original ragtime writer. He is one of the very first writers of the Harlem Rag. And that was being worked on in various versions in 1894, and I think it was actually published in 1896 as the first work of ragtime. So he worked his way back from Nevada, where he had a gold mine, and he moved back to St. Louis. So it's my conjecture that he's in town, and you can't prove he wasn't. So this was, of course, a very blurry picture. Sorry about this, and Eileen sent me a better picture, and I didn't get it in. My mistake. But this was part of the university hall at that time. This was James Canfield. He was the chancellor of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln from 1891 to 1895. And his favorite student was somebody named Willa Cather, who was here at that time. Here is another man who was at the time. Charles G. Dawes was actually a lawyer at the time, and he was a very good friend of John Pershing, and he was later vice president under Calvin Coolidge, and he was in Lincoln during that time, so we worked him into the novel. Here's Willa herself in her favorite kepi. She was known for wearing this Union Army hat throughout her junior and senior year. She worked at the State Journal, and she covered the local Lincoln theater scene. So you can still read some of her work from the Journal if you look that up. She also wrote about life in Nebraska, and we all had to read O Pioneers and My Antonia and some of those when we were growing up, and that was great. One of my favorite fellows is Lieutenant John J. Pershing. When he came to become commandant at the University of Nebraska cadets, they were in terrible shape. They couldn't march. They were rude and unruly, and so he was known as a martinet. He could straighten people's backs very clearly, and so Lieutenant, or the Loot, as his cadets began to call him, was very strict, but also very good. They grew to love him, and that happens oftentimes when you've got a tough commandant. The Pershing Rifles started right here at the University of Nebraska, and they got their name because of him, of course, but they were one of the only cadets that actually beat West Point at a drill competition in 1893. So just the year prior to that, he had really moved them up to competition, and he had them going. And of course, soon after this, he got his name Blackjack for his command in 1898 of the African American troops in San Juan Hill. So that was he was there at the time, and he's in the novel. George Flippin was here during that time, and he was halfback at the University of Nebraska, and the first African-American football player at the school, and one of the first at a university of any kind. And he was elected captain, believe it or not. But this man said, "You can't be captain," who was the first coach of the University of Nebraska football teams. Frank Crawford, although he was elected, Frank Crawford said, "No, we're not going to have that. We'll have someone else as the coach." But Frank Crawford did lead that team to its first ever championship team. So we had to beat 8 other people. And just going back a little bit to Lieutenant Pershing, the cadets had their training about the same time as the militia did. And of course, the cadets of the University of Nebraska showed up any militia you could ever gather, because they're a bunch of farmers coming in, and they meet once a year, and here's the Lieutenant Pershing with his crack cadets. And what the people would meet when they came out to the drill field, which was just out here in the lake, just to the site, just north of the stadiums there. What's the name of that lake? Remind me.
Oakland.
Yeah, that's it. So they would practice there, and they would have a raft that was floating out in the middle, and they actually had some old guns from the Civil War, and they would actually shoot rafts that had the Kansas flag on it. That would be part of their training regime. I thought that was a pretty good idea. I'm sorry if we got any Kansans out there. That one is for my brother-in-law. So all of these places are in the book, and should you be interested at some point, this is my home church of Alder Grove. in Nebraska, and of course Fremont, which is the area I'm from. We talked a little bit about the actual riots that occurred there, as well as this is actually the oldest bar in Lincoln, or in Nebraska. This is actually located in Columbus, and you actually can go out there. It still stands. I think it's an ice cream parlor, but it will serve beer. So I don't recall exactly what the name of that was, but of course had to throw in some of the areas like Fairbury. Fairbury is a beautiful city. People have gone there before? Lived there. Great. Wonderful. Lived there 12 years. You know, anybody remember what else was happening in Fairbury at that time? One of the things that we don't think about, the circus lived there. That was the winter headquarters for a fairly large circus. Camel Brothers, that's it. And if you go to Fairbury, you can see on the side of one of the buildings, there's a painting, I think, is that right? Of the circus during that time. So, and this is, I think, one of the most beautiful courthouses in the state. So, we also went all the way out to Sidney, Nebraska, and of course, we all love Sidney, right? But because of Cabela's, right? Cabela's is out at Sidney, right? But it wasn't at that time. There were a lot of bars, and that occurred. That's pretty much all I've got. If you'd like, we can chat for a bit more about whatever topic you're interested in. Does anybody know? I know that it's probably cost that's stopping this footbridge from occurring, but I mean, just seeing the hands here in town, who's interested in a bridge like that? Is that something that you would use? Okay, here and there. I do know those folks down there. When we went down to our, I'll tell you, when we went to our get-together on Friday night, kind of the memorial service, one of the things that we noticed was there's a lot of mosquitoes there. And so I got there with my sister, and we were enjoying that time together. And as it turns out, I had forgotten my mosquito repellent and how important that was at that time. So I did have an extra book with me, and I thought a swap for the book for mosquito repellent was one of the better things I could have done there. And so if anybody had been down there, you would have made a real good deal there. Yes, sir.
Can you click back to the bridge?
Yes.
And is anyone here from the Great Plains Trail Network? Excuse me.
Great Plains Trail Network.
Yeah, they're big supporters of this. And just today in the mail, I got a mailing from them. They need $230,000 more to finish the bridge. So those
Boy.
people who raised their hand that are in favor of the bridge, and maybe a couple others that didn't, should plan to give some money. The price went way up, didn't it? It was under $2 million, and now it's $2.2 million.
Well,
They need money, and they need the money by the 19th of August.
oh wow, that's a tough one.
But I'm sure someone in this room.
Someone named Foot. Anybody here named Foot? They would be the ones we'd really want. A grandfather or whatever would be great there.
And they could do it with the condition that it be named the Foot Bridge.
That absolutely. That would be good. That would be great. Now, I used to always get to this place by going to Densmore Park. I probably shouldn't be admitting this on TV, but and then crossing the track and going across until I found that wasn't legal. So okay, I don't do that anymore. But it is a long walk down there. So should you decide to go visit, we generally park further north off Old Cheney Road, and then it's about a mile south of there where you can find this wreck site. And I was very surprised in looking at some of the wreck pictures that we actually were able to find when we put the site of the wreck in, when we put the site of the marker in, we were right at where that wreck had landed. And we put it in there because it was kind of a convenient spot. But I've done some actual geolocation, and it couldn't have been off by more than a foot. So we were really close to where that is. So, tip your hat to Ike DePew and some of the other folks that have done that in that time. Any other questions that we've got about the wreck? Yes.
Just one historic side note. Anyone that's familiar with Breda Park,
Okay.
which happens to be where I live, Colonel Bill's daughter
Oh.
was the Breda that Breda Park is named after.
How about that? Okay. It's all connected, isn't
He
it?
owned the whole block. that
Okay.
Part of the park.
And that's here in Lincoln?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, great, great. Any other questions? Yes?
Some of the survivors must have lasted into the 1940s or 50s. Do you have any information on that?
Let me talk about one, because I got some really nice information from a guy by the name of Kevin Snell, who tells me about what happened to Harry Foote. And Harry Foote was married in late 1893 to an O.F. Foote, or her name was Oriel Florestein. You know, what a great name. Why don't we have names like that anymore? I mean, those are wonderful names. I'll never see an Oriel as far as that's concerned. And he actually, he lived in another, until, I think it says here in 1910, I think. Yeah, he passed away because I'll just read this to you. Conductor George Marriott of this city says Harry Foote, the Rock Island conductor, was killed Tuesday in the yards in Hennessy, which is in Oklahoma. Once performed a historic deed that attracted the attention of the whole country. So this must have been a more famous wreck than we treat it today. Mr. Marriott doesn't remember the date, but young Foote had just worked as a brakeman. So he was married a few years ago in 1900, and then he was killed in 1901 as a conductor. He got promoted from brakeman to conductor, and the train had stopped and was changing cars, and he fell down between the cars when the cars were being changed. During that time, they didn't have the kind of couplings we've got today in trains. You actually had to drop pins between the cars. There was a hole, and then you had to line up the hole, and you had to drop a pin in it. And I don't know if you've ever seen any old railroad fellas, but what you find is that oftentimes they're missing fingers, right? You know, you can miss a finger so quickly, and they would say that you weren't going to be a good conductor unless you'd lost at least a couple of fingers. So now I don't know that that's true, but that definitely was a piece of the problem. Some of the other survivors, you know, some people died later on from wounds or from whatever. My original information was that Harry Foote had passed away until I got some better information. Apparently, Harry Foote is a common name, because there's a number of people who claim that he was their ancestor, and I think we finally traced down the right people from finding the right. So I thank Kevin Snell for that. But there are probably others that were surviving. We don't talk a lot about the survivors in the newspaper articles, do we? We talk a lot about those that passed, and then we move on. It's another one of those things where you know, this was a major event 125 years ago, and we all remember Charlie Starkweather's name, okay? But we don't remember Harry Foote. So I'd like to see us try to do that if we can. Any other questions? We've got about 2 minutes left. Okay.
Where's Harry buried?
It looks to me like he's buried in St. Joe. His family was in St. Joe, and he's buried there under that name, and I'd love to go find that. One last bit. George W. Davis was pardoned by the governor 10 years later because there was not enough evidence in the governor's mind to convict him. So he went to work for a farmer up in Beamer, Nebraska. And I actually went up and visited that family farm, and they could remember the uncle, who was kind of a curmudgeon, but he would help people who were coming out of prison, and he would hire them. But then the thinking is that he worked at the button factory that was there at the prison. Our prison here in Lincoln had a button factory. And a button factory opened up in Omaha, and the thinking is that he probably went there next, and then we lost track of him. So, okay. Anything else? Great. Thanks very much for your time, folks.